on this computer. Okay, so this will be, I think, the 6th episode or installment of the study series on the seven-headed beast. I anticipate that we should be able to get done tonight, but we'll see. Really, at this point, we're sort of getting down to some interesting details about the 7th head of the beast, which I think corresponds, biblically speaking, to the 7th world empire that will be significant in the series of empires that the Bible draws attention to in relation to the nature of their interaction with Israel, particularly when the people of God are in the land and they have a temple in Jerusalem. That has been the case with all of the predecessors. Even though not all of the predecessors destroyed the temple, they all had some kind of dominion or struggle with Israel in the land when Israel had a temple, to some extent, one way or the other, in all the predecessor 6 empires, which finished up with the Roman Empire of the 1st century, or at least through the 1st century, Rome being the 6th in the series, which left a single remaining head of this system to come about at some future point. According to the book of Revelation's discussion in chapter 17, as it presents the sequence of the heads of the beast, these angelic, what it identifies there in reference to an angelic king and his associated angelic kings, 7 heads. The final head, the 7th head, was yet to come at the time that John was writing the book of Revelation, and when he came, he would have only a short space. So that means that the 7th head is not a long-lived empire. And if you use the reference of the predecessors in which Israel was always in the land with the temple, you understand why it's only a short space that the Bible is particularly interested in this kingdom, this 7th head, and that's because Israel only has a temple in the land for a final 7-year period or over that period. So it is a short space. And when we look at the symbol of Revelation 13, and we see the revival of one of the heads, which is something Revelation 17 also talks about and is indicated possibly by Daniel 2 as well. And then we see in chapter 13, verse 11, that John says, I saw another beast, right? And that beast has 2 horns. So we have a 10-horned beast that gives its power to the angel king that ascends out of the bottomless pit. And then we have a 2-horned beast. And so this makes sense. We have 2 empires at the end in this short period, vying for power in some respects, cooperating in some respects. The angels are on the who are ruling these are working together in their satanic opposition to God's work, but the earthly empires may fight against one another, as has always been the case as they transitioned one to the other. And so each of the 7 beastly empires that has gone, at least the 6 that have existed in the world already, they have had a leading city. I mean, that's pretty non-controversial. They all had their leading city or cities. And when we get to Revelation 17, 18, and part of chapter 19, we see the depiction of one such leading world city that there is referred to by the term Harlot. This term is associated, as we saw in the book of Nahum, with other cities of these empires on the list, including Assyria, its capital city of Nineveh, and the capital city of ancient Egypt. In particular, we see the title Babylon being applied in Revelation 17 to this harlot city, connecting the capital of Babylon to this. We have the one at the end with this title. And then in Peter's epistle, he seems to use the title Babylon to refer to Rome, where he is believed to have been at that time. And so many of these cities have these similar titles. Each of these empires has one of these cities. So in Revelation 17, as we said, we have to determine, okay, is this the great city of the 2-horned empire or the 10-horned empire? And the answer, the most reasonable answer, I think, based on what's supplied in the text immediately, is that the 10 horns hate this city and they destroy it. So it doesn't seem like this is a city that's one of theirs that they need, that's important to their economic or political world. It seems like it's an oppositional force, or at least it's viewed that way by them. And its destruction does not cripple them. It would cripple a country. Imagine if there was a destruction of London or New York or Paris. It was total in the way that this seems to be describing. that would be hugely detrimental to a growing empire or nation at the very time when that nation is going to survive and thrive according to Revelation. The 10 horns at that point are just coming into their own, and so it seems more easy to associate this with a different empire, which makes sense. There is a two-horned empire there at that time, and so we also have the fact that both this leading city and the two-horned empire of Revelation 13, 11 through 18 are both very much involved in the same types of activities. The idea of spiritual fornication, deception of the nations, false religion, miracles, and that sort of thing, as well as some indicators of great economic power. So that makes sense also to associate the city with that two-horned empire rather than the 10-horned empire for those reasons. We looked in one of the previous weeks about the details that are provided in the places that they're provided about the geography of the 10 horns, which I said, in my understanding, is somehow basically a Middle Eastern region. As we see, it's the terminology that's used in passages in Ezekiel and in Daniel, and you could go to a few other places, but certainly indicate a region that is bounded by Turkey on the north, Egypt to the south, Persia to the east, and that is consistent with the area of the Seleucid kings, which is one of Alexander's generals who ruled essentially from Turkey down through Israel and sort of a little bit east or west on the way. And so that's the indicators we have about the 10 horns. The little horn that emerges among the 10 horns is emerging in the areas indicated by in those passages to correspond to those sort of modern points that we know in the Middle East. So that's helpful to the extent that we have that information to be able to look for that or be aware of that possibility. And then the natural question would be, well, what about the two-horned empire, that beast? What about that head? Where's that going to be at? Is there any indications? I mean, you got a big world out there that is, beyond the Middle East, beyond the area of Northern Africa up into, Southeastern Europe and Western Asia. There's a lot of land and peoples that could be candidates for that, and we want to see if the Bible provides any particular information that might help us identify it when it happens. And so as we did that and we looked at Revelation 17 and 18, we saw, particularly chapter 18, that a lot of the language that's in there that's describing the harlot city and the fall of the harlot city and the features of that city and the prominence of that city are correspondent exactly, almost word for word, certainly intentionally, to passage in the Old Testament that discuss a group of people that existed in the ancient world but haven't been around for a long time in terms of world culture, and that was a group known as the Phoenicians. And so the Old Testament identifies them by that term and by the term Canaanite predominantly, which is the biblical equivalent, as well as the cities that they occupied, such as Tyre and Sidon, which were in Lebanon. So from there, this people group that starts on the Mediterranean coast, the Eastern Mediterranean coastline, they spread further and further westward across the Mediterranean world, all around the coasts of Africa and Southern Europe, over towards Spain. And they became to be identified with the term Kittim in the scriptures, which was a reference for Western islanders or coastal dwellers and sea traders of the Mediterranean world. And so the Bible starts to use that term to refer to these people, the Phoenicians. And so if we have the 10 horns in the Middle East, and then we have what the language is referring to, a group of people that spreads westward across the Mediterranean world and is dependent upon seafaring culture and trade, then that's a helpful identifier. Now, we don't know exactly, that doesn't necessarily mean that we're looking for a North African nation or a Southern European nation or anything to that extent. Certainly that's where we might start. But when we look at the information we have about, for example, the angel who ruled the Roman Empire of the ancient period, his empire starts out in Rome, in Italy, but it spreads westward eastward, until it's actually situated in Constantinople in Turkey. The same with Alexander the Great. He starts out in Macedonia in Greece, and then he spreads eastward, and then ends up with his like capital cities being situated in Mesopotamia and even farther over towards India. So they don't always stay in the same place. And I don't know that the Bible is using these references to the Phoenicians to say it's the Phoenicians, because and we'll talk about this a little bit more at the end of the study, what this connection to the Phoenicians does or doesn't indicate or can't tell us. And so we'll start with learning some more things about the Phoenicians, as we see the connection has been made between the great harlot city of what appears to be the Seventh Empire, the Two-Horned Empire, and the Phoenician people. So some of these characteristics seem to be in view. Certainly in the text of Revelation, we see some of these surfacing through the description. So the first is that the Phoenicians are pretty much identical to the biblical Canaanites. The people groups are the same, whichever term you're using. The Phoenicians may refer to sort of a more northern group of Canaanites who lived in the northern part of Israel and Lebanon, whereas in the Bible, the Israelites end up involved with those inhabiting the land of Israel to the south. But they were spread all around through there. And so if you look at Merriam-Webster's dictionary, it says a Canaanite, a member of a Semitic people inhabiting ancient Palestine and Phoenicia. So under Phoenicia, under the Columbia Encyclopedia, ancient territory occupied by the Phoenicians, these people were Canaanites. The Greeks gave them the name Phoenicians. That was the term the Greeks gave them. And there's a reason for why the Greeks used that term to describe these people. The Phoenicians had a culture and a language similar to other Semitic peoples, and they're considered to be generally identical to the Canaanites of the northern area of the Canaanites. They were known for their seafaring culture, which was something that is unique, or at least uniquely identified with them. So it's not certain, this is from Britannica, it's not certain what the Phoenicians called themselves in their own language, but it appears to have been Canaani, which is equivalent to the biblical word from which we get Canaanite. And so the term in the Bible also has the secondary meaning of merchant, which is certainly part of the picture here. So the Phoenicians, as we've already seen, were major seafaring traders of the ancient world. Trader, T-R-A-D-E-R, trade. And so we see from Britannica that they were merchants and traders and colonizers in the ancient world. They traded, and then this is the description: wood, dye, cloth, embroideries, wine, decorative objects, ivory, wood carvings. They were known also as goldsmiths and metalsmiths. So some of those things are the very language that we find in not only Revelation 18, but also some of these Old Testament descriptions of the people of the Phoenician or Canaanite heritage and their cities. And so one of the things that is interesting about the Phoenicians is the way that they spread. When we talk about the Babylonians, certainly they spread their empire, they enlarged their borders. Babylon remained the capital, right? Same with the Assyrians. Nineveh really remains the capital. The Greeks spread around, the Persians spread from Persia westward over towards Greece and North Africa. But they pretty much remained like sort of for a period of time under the certain cities that they had and those that they took control over. But the Phoenicians had this other kind of thing that they did where their main city on the coast of Lebanon, known as Tyre, was destroyed at one point, and yet the culture survived because it had planted these colony cities that it traded with around the Mediterranean world, including one that was known as Carthage, which is more well known on northern Africa. And the term Carthage just means new city. So when Tyre was destroyed, Carthage became the great city of the Phoenicians. And so this is something that happens with the Phoenicians, and I'll just read some of the descriptions here again from Britannica. The Carthaginian period. North Africa entered the mainstream of Mediterranean history with the arrival of the Phoenician traders. The Phoenicians were looking not for land to settle, but anchorages or staging points on the trade route from Phoenicia to Spain, a source of silver and tin. The sites chosen were generally offshore islands or easily defensible promontories with sheltered beaches on which ships could be drawn up. Carthage, his name is derived from the Phoenician Kart Hadesh, meaning new city. It was destined to be the largest Phoenician colony. And in the end, it was an imperial power of its own. And so it eventually gets into war with the Roman Empire. And that really is what results in the destruction of the Phoenicians for all time. They just disappear when the Romans destroy the city, which is interesting because when you talk about the revival of the Sixth Empire, which Revelation 17 identifies as Rome, at least the time period there signifies Rome, which is what is normal in the sequence from Daniel as well, and was understood by the Jewish people in that sequence and early Christians and most Christians today, that Rome is the sixth empire in the sequence, and that the angel that was associated was ruling over that, the one that is at that time, he is the one who comes out of the abyss and receives power from the 10 kings. And so the angel of the 10 kings, the 10 horns in the end times, is the same angel that once presided over the Roman Empire. And then what do you see the 10 horns do? They're going after a harlot city that's described in terms borrowed from Old Testament language about the Phoenicians. So there's definitely a historical context that supports the kind of association that we're drawing here of certainly this angel that rules over Rome. We said he's not necessarily going to start out in Rome, Italy, with the ancient Etruscans and Latins and Latin-speaking culture again. He's simply ruled that empire, and now will rule an empire that seems to emerge from 10 nations in the Middle East at some point. In the same way, the references to the Phoenicians don't necessarily require us to look for a nation or an empire or alliance that is all around the coastlines of the Mediterranean Sea, but we are looking for a nation that exemplifies these traits at the very least. And so we'll talk some more about that. But again, you can see just how far west the Phoenicians had gone, all the way over at least to Spain, which is about as far as you can go west from the old world. And so as a result, one of the things we can also know about the Phoenician culture is that it was really comprised of what were semi-independent city-states. So you didn't really have, countries around most of the world back then the way we do today. You did have empires in which somebody's domain was spread over a large region based upon their control of particular cities and roadways maybe, but it wasn't the same sort of thing that we see today in terms of the whole world is carved into these borders that are very firmly identified and held. So back then they had cities, and the cities were really the pinnacle of where your territory extended to. And in the case of the Phoenicians, each of these cities was semi-independent. Although the Phoenicians did have a king, essentially each of these cities were run by powerful merchant families that were allied to one another in trade alliances. So you can see the dominance of commercialism in their political or societal structuring according to these comments. So again, we'll look at some references just so people know that I'm not really making this up, but Encyclopedia Britannica says of the Phoenicians talking about Spain, but in that article it talks about the background is the Phoenician interest in the far west. Phoenician commerce was conducted by family firms of ship owners and manufacturers who had their base in Tyre or Byblos and then placed their representatives abroad. The next quote from Columbia Encyclopedia says, Phoenicia, the geographic boundaries of the territory are vague. The name Phoenicia may be applied to all the places on the shores of the Eastern Mediterranean where the Phoenicians established colonies. It often refers to the heart of the territory where the great Phoenician cities, including the most ancient of those cities, Tyre and Sidon, stood. But by 1250, the Phoenicians were well established as the navigators and traders of the Mediterranean world, enjoying commerce, and their communities were organized into city-states. The greatest of these originally were Tyre and Sidon. Of course, we know that Carthage ultimately becomes important. Wherever the Phoenicians ranged across the Mediterranean Sea, they founded outposts and colonies that later became independent cities. Of the most important were Utica and Carthage. And this is from Wikipedia. Is and this will be important as well, it's uncertain to what extent the Phoenicians ultimately viewed themselves as a single ethnicity. Now, it's true, biblically speaking, that this people group emerges from offspring of Canaan, of Ham, of that line. But considering where they were at, there was also opportunity for them to mix in with other peoples. Certainly something they wanted to do or tried to do with the Jewish people when they came into the land. But it's also the case that as they spread across the Mediterranean world, they encountered other peoples that were descended from other sons of Noah and their descendants, right? So if Japheth's descendants are largely the people groups that we look at, identify with geographies of Northern Europe and Northern Asia to some extent, and in Central Asia as well to another extent. And then we have Ham and his descendants in the southern areas ranging from east to west, including across Africa, North Africa, and then eastward into parts of Asia and Southeast Asia. And then the Semitic groups were all sort of in the middle, where all those other groups come together. And so that's where the Phoenicians start out. But as they spread to other parts of the Western world across Northern Africa and Southern Europe, they're making contact with trade partners from the peoples that are there. And this is going on for centuries. So it goes on to say here in the Wikipedia article, there is little to set the Phoenicians apart as markedly different from other cultures of Canaan. As Canaanites, they were unique in their remarkable seafaring achievements. Each of the cities was a city-state, which was politically an independent unit, though they would come into conflict and one city would be dominated by another city-state, although they would collaborate also in leagues or alliances. So the reason we get all this information that's important to maybe look at this kind of information is if the Bible in Revelation 18 is providing reference points to Old Testament scriptures that discussed or described the Phoenicians, then it's reasonable to consider that whatever was true for the Phoenicians, that Revelation is using that information to say, that's what this two-horned empire is going to look like. That's what this harlot city's empire is going to be like. And so when we learn these factors about the Phoenicians, we can kind of put that together and say, well, maybe that's something we should be looking for or be aware of, at least as we come maybe to the end times, or we're getting closer to it in any case. Another thing that's interesting about the Phoenicians in their day was that their language, the Phoenician language, was the common trade language of the ancient world. So this is even more important then, to a certain extent than it is now, because now we do have sort of a common trade language, which is often English, although in some places Spanish is also very usable and very useful from country to country and state to state based on European settlement patterns a couple centuries ago. But English has become very dominant in this respect as a trade language across Europe and really around the world. So we understand the concept of it. Of course, we have all kinds of other things that help facilitate translation and intercultural and international dialogue. But in the ancient world, they didn't have all the other extras that we have. So in terms of the technology that assists in this and the other points of contact, they had the importance of the Phoenician language in that respect was even more significant. And so we're looking for a country. This isn't too unexpected if they are dominant as a trade nation and they sail around to different places and do trade with people, then you would need a way to communicate. And one way to facilitate that communication would be through the language of the Phoenicians. And then as they spread and they had trade interactions and trade partnerships and colonies in different places, their language would spread to those locations and out from there as they expanded their influence and as the trade grew. And so in this next section, this is from Columbia Encyclopedia, it just talks about the importance of the Phoenician alphabet. It served as a basis for the Greek alphabet and was a key factor in the development of Greek culture. So here's where we get the term Phoenicia or Phoenician, because as we saw earlier, they originally were just Canaanites, they were merchant peoples. And so where did the term Phoenicia, which is more used in scholarly circles, whereas Canaan is more common to biblical discussions, the term Phoenicia was actually given to this group of people by the Greeks, and we'll see why as we read through this. This is from Columbia Encyclopedia again. Phoenicia, the ancient territory occupied by the Phoenicians, they were Canaanites in the 9th century BC. The Greeks gave them the new appellation Phoenician. And so they also colored cloth with the famous Tyrian purple, named after the city of Tyre. And the Greek word for purple is equivalent or comes from or ends up being the word Phoenician or related to it. So obviously we're extrapolating to the people name. And so the reason the Greeks called them this is because of their association with this unique ability that they had, this color that was associated with them that they used to dye their cloths. And so the Greeks were like just referring to them as the people who made that color. And so here's the quote from Lebanese American Global Information Center. So they're going to talk about this because obviously Lebanon is where this group's homeland started. And it says the Canaanites who inhabited that area were also called Phoenicians by the Greeks, from the Greek word phoinos, meaning red, in reference to the unique purple dye that the Phoenicians produced from seashells. And so to me, when we start seeing that as well, the color association, I think about a couple of things that show up in the text of Revelation: the idea of a scarlet colored beast, the mention of purple and scarlet embroidery and cloth that is sold by the great harlot city. Again, underscore for me that this is an intentional biblical reference, that it's intending to make this connection for us. Another thing that's interesting about this is the idea of the word Phoenician and the color association of scarlet, and the idea of the phoenix, which is a mythological bird. Now, the story of the mythological bird, which we call the phoenix, which is scarlet, purplish red in color, is interesting in relation to some of the stuff we see about these people over the course of history. From another encyclopedia reference, the phoenix is a mythical bird which, upon sensing its approaching death, would build a nest of aromatic wood, set the wood on fire, and allow itself to be consumed by the flames. And then from the ashes of the funeral pyre, this burning nest, a new phoenix would spring to life and would fly off, right? And so think about this. The city of Tyre was destroyed, and yet Carthage came into power. The description, the final description of the harlot city is that she's burned with fire, and then the smoke of her burning goes up forever and ever. So she never rises from that flame. And the color associations are there, right? The idea of colored embroidery that is purple and scarlet is there. And so talking about the cries and the songs of the harlot city, the phoenix was associated with the worship of the sun. It had a brilliant scarlet and gold plumage and melodious cry. Only one phoenix existed at a time. It was very long lived. And so these are things that are potentially also points of correspondence that we're on the right track, these sorts of associations. And when we talk about the idea of this harlot city riding the beast, as we said, like each of these ancient empires has a great city. When we look at the book of Daniel, and it's using the descriptions of the Chaldeans or wise men of Babylon, which it uses a reference point, a description identity to the harlot city and the mystery religion that they put forward. In the book of Daniel, we have quite a bit of information about that group of people and their tactics, their approach, and their use of astrology and other things to try to understand the future. Nebuchadnezzar suspects that these guys knew that the time was coming for his kingdom to end and that they were just kind of waiting it out. And then, of course, when his kingdom does end, they remain in power under the Persians, which conquered Babylon. And so the idea that this group of aristocratic, wealthy noblemen who are part of the court of the whatever the ruling nation is in each generation and each time period, that they ride the beast. They're staying in power. They're staying behind the scenes. And the idea of the every time one of these empires nears its end, they're aware of it and they just make their nest, let it burn, and then move on to the next place, to the next empire. So that there's the concept that that component of it has been this false religious component, which is certainly part of this system, both in Revelation 13:11 through 18, as well as in Revelation 17 and 18. That component's been there through each of the kingdoms and each of their great cities, and here it is in the end times being put to great use, particularly through the great city of the two-horned beast. And so we talked about how in Isaiah 23, referring to the Phoenicians, it uses the term Kittim, which Daniel 11:30 also talks about the ships of Kittim that oppose the kings of the north, which is an association we have for the Antichrist as the final figure who comes out of that. It's possible that verse 30 of Daniel 11 is referring to an end times event in which we're seeing this antagonism between the earthly Antichrist and this Western power that is in Daniel being described through the term Kittim. And so that we see that similar reflection that's also present in the Romans versus the Phoenicians. And it has some sort of end times manifestation, although not necessarily with Rome, Italy, and the Phoenician world as it was, but something that is similar to the Phoenicians and the angel who once ruled over Rome. So that similar occurrence is taking place. And so if we were to try to trace this out and say, well, okay, what do we do with this information? One of the things we would want to take note of is that as we look at the sequence of the 6 empires that started, you start with Assyria or Egypt. Next, you have Babylon, which is largely situated in the same area that was ruled by Assyria. And then Persia, which is east of Babylon in terms of where it starts. And then it goes westward. And then the next one is Greece, which is further west than any of them at that point. And then Rome, which is even further west than Greece. And so the trajectory of the point of origin for each empire is moving west in each of the last part of the series, from Persia to Greece to Rome. If that trend were to continue, we would expect that the two-horned beast or empire, the 7th head, would have an even further west or westerly origin point, maybe. So that's worth considering. And in that line, we also have this information about the Phoenicians and what were they doing? Well, they were moving further and further west. They're known to have gotten at least to Spain. There's been a number of authors that have speculated they went even further, possibly to England, which I think is something that was much more popular a century and a half ago. But there's been a lot of speculation that they had gotten up there where there's also tin deposits, which is something that they were interested in trading, the mineral tin. And so from Britannica, we see the Phoenicians, excavations confirm that the Phoenicians settled in southern Spain. They were in Tunisia and North Africa. Search for new commodities led them even farther westward. And this was the reason for the interest in southern Spain's mineral wealth, et cetera, et cetera. This is the background for the Phoenician interest in the far west. So to see the trend of Western origin points for each of the last, the origin point moving further and further west for each of the last 3 or 4 empires that we know of, and then to see a reference to the great harlot city of the 7th empire, what appears to be that association, with a group that keeps moving further and further west. Spain is further west than Rome. So that seems to be potentially supportive of the idea we're looking for a 10-horn Middle Eastern power and then a 2-horn power that has a Western base. There's a couple of reasons to consider that. So another thing that's interesting in terms of correspondence is, in the ancient world, when you divide it up in directions in terms of what the biblical world looked like, you had the north, which was everything up till Turkey and maybe slightly farther north than that. The east, which was over towards Babylon and Persia. They certainly were aware of farther east, but that's really the parts that were most involved in the world of Israel, the interaction with Israel. And then you have the south, which was, down to Ethiopia and Egypt and that sort of thing. And then the west was west across northern Africa and Europe. Europe was kind of the west, even though for us, we know it's northwest more accurately. So when you think about the term Europe and the Phoenicians going further and further west to places like Spain in Europe, the term Europe becomes interesting in this because where does the term Europe come from? And in fact, the term Europe is derived from the name of an ancient Phoenician princess known as Europa. And so Europa was a princess and moon goddess who was carried away to the island of Crete originally by the Greek god Zeus in the form of a white bull. So there's a couple of things here that some of which I think are most likely connected, and others which I think are interesting possible connection points. One is the idea of a woman being carried by an animal as the Phoenician princess, and the harlot being described in terms related to the Phoenicians as riding the beast are interesting, is an interesting similar theme that's presented here in the Bible and that has some sort of reflection in the pagan history of religion for this part of the world. It's also interesting that a bull has two horns, which is the same thing as the two-horned beast of Revelation 13:11. So I think that's interesting. And the idea that she's being carried further and further westward. In addition to that, we talked about the angel of the seventh empire. And we said that most likely, there's at least very good reason to consider that the angel who rules over the seventh empire, the two-horned empire, is the devil himself, the chief angelic adversary, who many often refer to as the term Lucifer, or the name Lucifer, and that he's cast out of heaven. He has only a short time. The seventh head or angelic king and his kingdom are only for a short time. And what does he do? According to 2 Thessalonians and in Revelation 12, he's responsible for false miracles and deceiving the nations. And that's what the harlot's doing. And that's what Revelation 13:11's two-horned beast is doing. And so there's a lot of correspondence there to think that the chief adversary, the devil, is the angel who is the prince or king over this seventh empire, which is Phoenician terminology, Phoenician descriptions associated with. And yet we also have the series of trumpets in Revelation in which there's a star that falls from heaven to earth. It's cast from heaven to earth, same language as the devil being cast from heaven to earth in chapter 12. And that star is eventually given the key to the bottomless pit to release others, including the angel king from the abyss, out of the bottomless pit. And so this is an angel. It's not a star. It's not a celestial object. It's an angel who's cast from heaven to earth, and he's given the name Wormwood. We talked about that in either earlier in this study or in our Four Horsemen study, I think. And wormwood in the Greek is Artemisia or absinthos. It was a reference to a plant that was known as Artemisia absinthos. So you have absinthos, which is the idea of the plant, and it's named for Artemis, the sister of Apollo. So Apollo has, as we said, correspondence to the idea of Apollyon, who's the angel king that comes out of the bottomless pit. And then Artemis is a moon goddess. Well, so is Europa. So there's just some interesting potential correspondence here, pointing towards the seventh kingdom, the two-horned beast, having some sort of association with the angelic god that was over the Phoenicians, or that was worshipped by the Phoenicians, or in some respect similar to that. Again, many of these gods had different names that they went by different cultures, the same thing, correspondence there. And so this helps us kind of think about where is this going to emerge. I mean, the biblical authors don't really have the tools to describe other parts of the world that weren't known to them and didn't have cultural associations and names in their time period, right? Like if the Bible authors wanted to describe someone or a culture in Australia or in South America, they really would have difficulty doing that in the biblical terms that are available to them. And if that were the case, it may not be the case that someone from such a place would be of relevance to the end times. But if that were to be the case, how would the Bible authors describe them using their linguistic toolkit? They wouldn't be able to say, oh, the South Americans, or the people from Brazil or Argentina or Peru, because those reference points don't exist. Same thing for Australia. They wouldn't be able to do that. What they could do is describe that people group in response to someone in the ancient world that they either resembled in some fashion, culturally speaking, or in terms of their political structure or the way that their power was derived, or maybe that has some sort of cultural link to these people, other than just similarities in the way their culture is. As I've said so far, I think at the very base, we can take from Revelation's reference points to the Phoenicians is that we're looking for things like a very powerful naval group that is very strong in world commerce and trade by the sea, that buys a lot of things and ships a lot of things and sells a lot of things, and that it was moving further and further westward, potentially associated with peoples of the West. We also know that we have this reference to the two horns, which in the biblical symbols means we're talking about a people group that has become strong through two cooperating nations, in the way that the Medes and the Persians helped form the great Persian Empire under Cyrus. We'd be thinking of something like that. I think that's a direct reference that's made, a comparison, I should say, that's made between Revelation 13:11 and Daniel 8's description of the Medes and the Persians. And so one of the things that's interesting about the Medes and the Persians, besides the fact that they were an empire formed from two related people groups, cooperating people groups, the Medes and the Persians, is they had a king, but they had the law of the Medes and Persians that was very prominent. Even the king was subjected, he had to go by what the law said, kind of an interesting thing in the ancient world. So there was this preeminence of law that's governing even the king. And the idea that what was Cyrus the Great, the Persian king that the Bible is most interested in, what was he responsible for? He was the king who received power over the area of Israel when Persia conquered Babylon. They took over that area that the Babylonians had, which included Judea and Jerusalem. And as a result of inheriting that power, and when he does, Cyrus, the Persian king, allows the Jewish people to return to their homeland from exile, from diaspora, and then to rebuild their temple at Jerusalem. So that has additional contact points for the end times, right? I mean, we know there's going to be a temple rebuilt. We know the Jews were in a long period of diaspora that began through a series of exiles, starting in the 60s and 70 AD in particular, and then continuing all the way to the first century under Hadrian and others, and at different times. So they've been in exile, in diaspora around the world until the 20th century. And then they return, they still haven't built a temple. They'll build a temple at some point shortly before Christ comes back. And lo and behold, at that time, there is a two-horned empire that's prominent in the world of politics, and that's very important and relevant to the biblical description of the end times. And false religion, by the way. So is it possible that the connection that we're seeing to the two-horned ram of the Medes and Persians not only depicts that this final seventh head will have two people groups that make it strong, that it comes out of, but also that it will be the people group that helps finalize or enable the Jewish people to be back in the land with a temple, something that we still haven't seen, that component of it at least. And so that's really interesting to be able to put all these potential factors together. Again, this is speculative to a certain extent. Hopefully it's informed speculation based upon information from the scripture, but it's something we should all take into account in terms of our modeling. And again, there may be other models that are out there that should also be considered along the way. You don't want to marry yourself to one thing, even though I have this one that I feel pretty strongly about, that has strengths that I feel are not present in some of the other things, that account for things that are not in some of the other models that are out there. And so to me, I can compile all of these data reference points into a composite sort of profile, which then we can use to sort of explore the world and say, okay, if this were something that was going to happen in the next 10 years, given that political trending is not going to drastically change to something that we've never seen all of a sudden, if we were to base this on current trajectories and current cultures and prominent powers, and thinking Christ would come back in the next couple of decades, maybe, then we'd have certain people that seem to mirror many of these pieces of information or descriptions that we find here about the Phoenicians, about these other factors. And so one of the things that pops into my head, and so now that we've kind of composed all this, I want to give an example of something that's potentially relevant to this. Again, this will be even more speculative, and then we'll kind of bring it all home here in just a few minutes. But when we think about the Persians and the role that the Persians played, the Medes and the Persians, in releasing the Jews back to their homeland, bringing them home to that, and rebuilding the temple. In the modern world, that did happen in the 20th century, 70 years ago, just over. And that happened as a result of some earlier things in the earlier 20th century. So at the beginning of the 20th century, we had World War I. As a result of World War I, the Ottoman Empire, which had control over most of the area of the Middle East, including Israel, the Ottomans sided with the losers. They lost that war, and then the lands that they held were turned over to the British and the French predominantly. Others also, but the Middle Eastern areas, that including, most importantly, the land of Israel, was turned over to the British and the French. In particular, the British had possession over the land of Israel. And then what happens as a result of the British having political dominion over the land of Israel and the area around it is that the British government's policy was to promote Jewish people going back to Israel for the purposes specifically of giving them sovereignty over that land, a portion of that land, which did not include Jerusalem, by the way, which is important to note. But that, at least in this respect, the British, who become the heirs of dominion over Israel through conquest in war, just like the Persians did, then do similarly in trying to promote the Jewish people going back into the land of Israel and repopulating that as their nation, their homeland. And so that is similar. Doesn't mean it's relevant to end times prophecy. Could be. It's just worth, an exercise. It's worth thinking through this, and it also depends on how soon this happens in our future. But certainly the British were the ones responsible for crafting the policy that resulted in the newly formed Jewish state of Israel. That's a matter of history. You can look it up and find out about the Balfour Declaration and the British Mandate and how they moved in that direction intentionally. And so this culminates in the formation of the State of Israel in 1948 as a result of what's going on with the British and their control. They ceded it. They gave it back to the Jewish people. And to other nations. Some of the Arabic nations were also formed at that time as a result of the British mandates and the French mandates over the Middle Eastern areas. So the world we have now is largely came out of that control. And what we see in Israel is a result of the British Empire and what it did at that time. So that's worth considering. And then certainly in 1967, Israel, as a result of a war that they're involved with their neighboring Arabic states, Israel takes control of Jerusalem itself, like all of it, Eastern Jerusalem, most importantly, which is where ancient biblical Jerusalem is at. And so now they have control of that. So those are things historically that are potentially relevant. So at the end of study tonight, we're pretty much concluding this study and the outline material that I have. I just want to run through some of the conclusions and the things that can tell us as we kind of plot our map and look at the landscape and the profiles going forward. And so all of these biblical details that we've been looking at may point towards a comparison between the Medo-Persian Empire, which was a two-horned empire, which was responsible for the reestablishment of the Jewish nation in the ancient world. And then we also have a discussion of, through the Phoenician references, of a very powerful naval, Western-based trading group or power or empire that is prominent in the world at that time. And so that's a lot more information than we had at the beginning of the study, or that we had before we'd done these studies, or that other study models offer. because in many other study models, the two-horned beast of Revelation 13 is not a political power. It's not an empire in the same way that the other beasts of Daniel and Revelation are. There's no sense of that component of it whatsoever, or what two horns means in that respect in the symbol system of Daniel and Revelation. And there's generally very little, at least I haven't come across many, who associate the harlot city with the seventh empire. There's at least one other author that I'm aware that makes this, although we have very different models with respect to this. But in that case, the references to the harlot city through the biblical terminology for the Phoenicians, it's pretty informative. And so what that means in terms of a Western-based naval power, sea trading group of semi-independent states that are allied with each other, that is, something that we might want to take into account, in which other models don't typically have anything about. So the other questions that kind of shake out of this are about the Phoenicians, the significance of the Phoenician references themselves. So on the one hand, you have what I tend to think of, which is that the Phoenicians are stand-ins here because there may not be an ancient biblical terminology that's available to describe whoever this eventual people is in the end times. And so the Phoenicians are very similar to what that people is going to look like. So they're using them as a stand-in. On the other hand, you might have the possibility that this end times people is actually somehow really descended from the Phoenicians. I tend to disagree with that possibility, or at least not really embrace it very much, for a couple of reasons. And so one of the things I want to cover up front is, if the Phoenicians are invoked here in some sort of way, and you take it to the extent that you think, well, okay, so the Phoenicians are the seventh empire, which again, not my point of view, just as I don't think that the Romans are the revived head. But if you take it that way, you end up with, well, Phoenicians were around when Israel was in the land with the temple, so shouldn't they be already on the list somewhere earlier in the sequence? Would that add another head to the list? And that only would be required if you believe that the ancient Phoenicians were intended to be relevant. I don't think the Bible is intending to invoke the ancient Phoenicians as a head, but somebody that resembles the ancient Phoenicians that exists in the end times as the seventh head. And so the Phoenicians never worked directly to oppose or had dominion over the land of Israel when Israel had a temple, as far as the Bible is really interested in these types of things with these countries. What about the angelic prince of the seventh empire? Is he the angel that was associated with the Phoenicians? To that, I'm open. Certainly it's possible to take language from Ezekiel 26, 27, 28 and say, okay, well, this is a description of the devil himself, and he's associated there as the sort of a cherub that is a prince over the Phoenicians in the city of Tyre. But again, if he didn't exert his power over Israel in the fashion that some of these others had, he didn't have dominion in that same extent or that same manner over Israel, then it's not necessary that God would have cast him out at the time. If God is casting these angels down and removing their people from power, removing power from the angels so the people lose power on earth, then if the Phoenicians never exercised or had that same power that, the Assyrians, the Babylonians, the Egyptians, the Persians, had, the Greeks and the Romans as well had, then we wouldn't need to count the Phoenician angel as among this number yet, until at some point when he does exercise that power. Now, if the angel was associated with the Venetians, you have the option of him always having to be associated with some people that are ethnically connected to the Phoenicians, or that this is a different angel who has similar characteristics or similar way of going about things. There's that option as well. So let me make sure I covered that right. Yeah. So is it possible that the Seventh Empire is comprised of ethnically Phoenician people? I don't think that's an answerable question by anybody, for a number of reasons, one of which is, what constitutes the ethnicity of the Phoenicians? As I said, originally they're derived from the Hamitic people from the line of Ham through Canaan, but as for many centuries, even for millennia, they were over a millennium, they were intermarrying with people of both other Semitic people groups, other descendants of Ham, other descendants of Japheth. So even one of the references is it's unclear at some point what the Phoenician ethnicity really was, because they were not geographically central or isolated to a particular region by which their ethnic identity would have been distinctly maintained as just members of one particular line. So that gives the possibility that the angel associated with Phoenicians has a little bit more leeway because he's mixed in with everybody. So how would you know? How would we know who or who isn't descended from Phoenicians in the world as it is 2,000 years since this was significant, since they were a significant people group, and their seed is spread over all the generations and everything going on as the European Western nations blended together, blended with other peoples, blended with people on the New World. People from the African continent also were over here through slave trades and other migrations. Asians have come over here from Eastern Asia, Northeastern Asia. I mean, there's just been a tremendous amount of blending and blurring that I think would make this almost impossible to go. That people group right there are the Phoenicians, like descendants. We can look and see what group is like sort of their political descendants in terms of what groups model these descriptions that we see in scripture about the way that their empire was empowered and what they were doing. So the Phoenicians were ultimately a multi-ethnic people. So where did the angel of Phoenicia go after the Phoenician Empire and people vanished from history? Maybe he was cast into hell and he's not the guy. Maybe he just stays in heaven because he doesn't ever infringe upon something regarding Israel and the temple, or that God says you got to get out until the end times. So maybe he's the devil himself. It's unclear. It's difficult to determine. And one other question I'll just throw here on the end is, what about all the other 6 angels? Are they all in hell, just like Apollyon is, who's one of those 6? Are the other 5 all in hell? My guess is they probably are, that at some point, like Apollyon, he's just a member of the pattern. 5 have fallen, 1 is. He ultimately ends up in the pit. He gets released. So my guess is that's indicative of a pattern, so that the first 5 are also in the bottomless pit. They're chained there as well. They probably may be released at that time. But it's possible that they're not, and it's difficult for me to be dogmatic about that. Certainly some of these angels remain in heaven under the devil's leadership. So with that in mind, it is 8:01. I'm gonna cut the recording. That'll be the end of the study. And then we can chat for a little bit and do prayer requests afterwards if you guys want to. So give me 1 second here.